Welcome back to Street Talk. We're extremely excited today to bring you this panel discussion with three seasoned experts in artificial intelligence. Now, it's been over 3 decades since the statistical revolution took the AI world by storm, and over a decade since deep learning helped usher in the latest resurgence of connectionism. However, the disappointing progress in conversational agents, natural language understanding, and self-driving cars has made it clear that progress has not lived up to the promise of these empirical and data-driven methods. Now, DARPA has suggested that it's time for a third wave in artificial intelligence, one that might be characterized by hybrid models that combine knowledge-based approaches with data-driven machine learning techniques. Now, this panel discussion will focus on the following fundamental concerns regarding the development of strong AI. So, what is wrong with current empirical approaches to artificial intelligence? Is it time to rethink the dominant paradigm? And what will the future look like? Is it hybrid models, an amalgamation of the previous 2 waves? And if so, what would these hybrid models look like? Or is it a third wave, something entirely new? Anyway, we're going to start with bios for the folks on the panel, and then we're going to have roughly 3-minute opening statements for everyone, and then we're going to go back and forth a little bit, and at the end of the panel discussion we'll have closing statements. So we've produced a fair bit of content on symbolic approaches to AI recently, and Machine Learning Street Talk is all about diversity of thought. This channel is non-commercial. I have no vested commercial interest in any particular paradigm, and that's why we can discuss all of them. I want Machine Learning Street Talk to remain the most unbiased podcast on artificial intelligence approaches. And in that vein, join us next week for a fascinating discussion with neuroscientist Jeff Hawkins, who's built a grand unifying theory of how the brain works, and his team in California are currently building new generations of machine learning models which more closely mimic the brain. And this really fascinates me, actually, because we're going to talk about this on the show today, but I'm a big believer that knowledge representation is the dark matter of artificial intelligence. If you solve the knowledge representation problem, you solve AI. And I think that knowledge representation is quite similar to representations of computation. And some folks believe that the kind of knowledge representation we have in the brain or neural networks are the way to go. And some folks think that high-level abstract symbols like functions and types are the way to represent knowledge. Who knows where it's going to go, but I think if we can figure this out, we'll be making good progress. Anyway, enjoy the show, folks, and we'll see you back next week. On the panel today is J. Mark Bishop. Mark is a Professor Emeritus of Cognitive Computing at Goldsmiths, University of London. In 2010, Mark was elected to the chair of the Artificial Intelligence and Simulation of Behavior, the world's oldest AI society. Mark has been invited to advise on policy at the UN, the EC, and the UK government. He's published 3 academic books, 200 articles, and won £3 million worth of research funding. Mark serves as an associate editor of 9 international journals, and Mark's research has spanned the practice and theory of artificial intelligence. Mark is interested in the philosophy of mind, and in particular, differences between human understanding and computational natural language understanding. In particular, Mark thinks that computational theories of mind cannot fully explain human cognition. He thinks that no computational program can ever fully instantiate human intelligence. You need autonomy, embodiment, and a social environment for intelligence to emerge. Mark believes that if a computational process were sufficient to realize consciousness, we would find consciousness everywhere, because the same state transitions executed in a computer program that is claimed to be conscious could be mapped onto the bricks of this building, the clothes you are wearing, the very seat you are sitting on. If machine consciousness is possible, then Everything is conscious. Even the smallest grain of sand would have an infinitude of conscious experiences. Gadi Singer is Vice President and Director of Cognitive Computing Research at Intel Labs. Cognitive computing research drives innovation in machine intelligence and cognition, combining deep learning with deep knowledge structures and symbolic reasoning to materially improve efficiency, explainability, extensibility, and reasoning capabilities of AI systems. Gadi joined Intel in 1983 and has since held a variety of senior technical leadership and management positions in chip design, software engineering, CAD development, and research. Gadi played a key leadership role in the product line introduction of several new microarchitectures, including the very first Pentium, the first Xeon processors, the first Atom products, and even more. He was the Vice President and Engineering Manager of groups including the Enterprise Processors Division, the Software Enabling Group, and Intel's Corporate Electronic Design Automation Group. Since 2014, Gadi has participated in driving cross-company AI capabilities in hardware, software, and algorithms. Prior to joining Intel Labs, Gadi was Vice President and General Manager of Intel's Artificial Intelligence Platforms Group. Now, Gadi received his bachelor's degree in computer engineering from Technion University in Israel, where he also pursued graduate studies with an emphasis on artificial intelligence.
Walid Saba is a polymath, a neuroscientist, a linguist, a psychologist, a philosopher, a statistician, and a logician. He is an expert in knowledge engineering, ontologies, and conversational AI. Walid lived through the transition from GoFi to empirical AI. One of the arguments he makes emphatically online is that natural language processing is not the same thing as natural language understanding. He further argues that language understanding requires discovering or uncovering all the missing text that is not in the data. He is extremely prolific on LinkedIn. We discovered him from reading his racy articles on the pitfalls of empirical AI methods. He thinks that the biggest problem with empirical AI is that most of the information isn't even in the data. It's simply missing from the text. He argues we need to perform analytical reasoning to acquire new knowledge, and that no amount of training data will allow deep learning to do that. Walid is the co-founder and principal scientist at ONTOLOGIK, a natural language processing startup. He was a principal AI scientist at Astound for 3 years. He was the co-founder and CTO of Clango for 6 years. He was an associate professor at the American University of Beirut and was associate professor at the University of Windsor for 7 years. He obtained his PhD in computer science from Carleton University and his bachelor's and master's in computer science from the University of Windsor. Now let's move on to opening statements. The order will be Gadi, followed by Mark, and then Walid.
Oh, in one word, hybrid, but probably we're expecting a bit more. So deep learning as a technology is extremely valuable, and it's improving at a very fast rate. It's very effective in what it does, whether it's pattern recognition, classification, and some other problems. And there's a broad set of applications that can take benefit of that. And actually, it is now starting major deployment over many markets, whether it's manufacturing, financial services, transportation, healthcare, and others. Because of its value, the answer for me is no winter is expected. There's a lot to be gained. However, there are some fundamental limitations to the underlying statistical correlation-based methods. And because of those deficiencies, there is a need for a new set of AI systems with new capabilities that will really enable us some things that are new. Systems which are able to understand language and its meaning, not just process form and predict next words. Systems that are inherently multimodal, that are able to interpret and use on the same semantic plane visuals and language and knowledge. Systems that integrate common sense knowledge and reasoning over that common sense knowledge systems that adapt to new circumstances, new domains, new tasks, and are able to explain themselves as they create new outputs in those new spaces. Systems that are more robust and more customizable due to the use of symbolic entities and abstracted concepts. And when those systems have more comprehension, they display more intelligence, I believe they will be more anthropocentric, and therefore I term them overall cognitive AI. Now, in this move from surface-level correlation to higher understanding and reasoning, the ability to interpret complex real-world situations, especially associated with people, AI needs to really know the world, its entities, their relations, their history, procedural knowledge, experiential knowledge. And in order to do that, it needs to have an internal model. It needs to have rich knowledge structure. Can it be done by neural network? Maybe some of it, but I don't really believe so. Language models contain a lot of information, even knowledge, and they can memorize a lot, but they are very inefficient and ineffective in structuring them in ontologies, in taxonomies, in causal models, and in other structures of deep knowledge. So I believe that the next phase is neurosymbolic cognitive AI, which will include explicit, structured, multimodal, multifaceted, well-attributed knowledge bases. Knowledge bases will utilize neural network and machine learning to extract information, to create nodes, to create relations, to check the coherence of the overall system, and to maintain it. So we should stop debating who is right, the connectionist, the symbolist, the Bayesians. Instead, we need to understand that each of those technologies have some significant strength. And the question is, how do we combine the strength based on the task to create the next generation of AI? And in particular, I believe that neural networks that are well integrated with a knowledge extraction and structuring and with symbolic reasoning are the foundations that can usher in a new era in AI.
In 2016, Jeff Hinton famously predicted that by the year 2021, now in other words, there would be no need to train radiologists because the performance of AI systems would be far superior. Repeatedly in that time span, futurologists such as Elon Musk have predicted level 5 automation is just around the corner. NLP practitioners have said larger and larger models such as GPT-3, 4, 6, 10 will be able to converse and understand language seamlessly, and yet even a modest and brief interaction with such systems reveals catastrophic failures of them. It's my belief that the same problem, the same issue is at the root of all these problems. Indeed, it's my belief that computation cannot realize understanding, deep mathematical insight, or consciousness, and hence that there exists a gap, a humanity gap, between that which can be achieved by computational processes alone and that which can be achieved by humans, potentially using computational tools. 3 a priori philosophical arguments, John Searle's Chinese Room, the Lucas Penrose argument, and my own minor contribution to the debate, the Dancing with Pixies reductio, underpin this claim. If any one of these arguments holds, then an unbridgeable ontological gap between computation and mind is firmly established. Well, aside from a diet of too much dodgy sci-fi, I believe a deep confusion between epistemic concerns, for example, how we as humans might seek to establish if a sister or brother had understood our words, or was feeling pleasure or pain, etc., and ontological, for example, how we might actually instantiate consciousness, pleasure or pain, in a machine, lie at the root of this widespread quasi-religious belief that computation can actually realize cognition. I suggest that any commitment to what the American philosopher John Searle famously terms strong AI, the view that suitably programmed computers can actually understand natural language or genuinely instantiate other mental capabilities of the humans whose behavior they mimic, is quasi-religious because, in asserting that the mind is independent of the biological material that embodies it, It masks a deeper commitment to a particularly pernicious form of substance dualism, wherein the mind can be uploaded into a suitable computer program and, in principle, live on forever in a future silicon heaven. A concept expertly toyed with by William Gibson in Neuromancer and much earlier by the author Arthur C. Clarke in Against the Fall of the Night and the City and the Stars. The underlying confusion between epistemic and ontological concerns is neatly foregrounded in the following. We might model a cow lactating, a plant photosynthesizing, or the physical properties of gold by computational processes. However, such purely computational processes will never make us milk, produce energy from sunlight, nor, sadly, make us rich. Why then should we ever expect computation to physically instantiate cognition, contra model some particular cognitive processes of interest, for example, neural firing rates? In other words, although we can model the behavior, say, of the planets by the correct application of Kepler's laws, the planets themselves neither compute those laws nor follow them in unfolding their own sublime dances.
I truly believe that there's something seriously wrong in artificial intelligence. The biggest problem is that we are equating AI with machine learning. Yes, it's true that symbolic AI or GoFi that dominated AI from the mid-50s until the late 80s, early 90s, lacked a learning component, which of course made it brittle in new situations. True also that symbolic AI faced the knowledge bottleneck problem, so learning was a crucial missing component. In fact, there's ample evidence that most of the knowledge that really matters is not and cannot even be learned. And this can be theoretically proven, even ironically using learnability theory itself. For example, no algorithm can learn if we give it millions of unsorted data collections paired with sorted data collections. No learning algorithm can discover that we can sort in order n log n. This has to be deductively derived. This cannot be learned from tons or trillions of tons of data. In my opinion, this zealous drive to push learning as the only paradigm that will get us to AGI is not only misleading, but it's very counterproductive. We keep building larger and larger language models in a futile attempt at trying to approximate the infinite number of thoughts we can make in language. In self-driving technology, we completely ignored the frame problem in AI. That is a problem that any autonomous intelligent agent must face, even in domains that are naturally data-centric, like image recognition. The current state-of-the-art cannot successfully be employed in critical situations because they are susceptible to adversarial examples. So to make a long story short, data-driven techniques are no doubt part of the tool set. That's fine. Everything we're doing now is a small fraction of what we will have eventually when we get close to AI. Cognition is a lot more than finding a nice function that covers all the data. I think this should also be done because this is affecting a whole generation, in my mind, that we lost because they really hang on to the claim that they are doing AI. And I think they are doing very little that has to do with AI.
Well, we've had 3 introductions there from our panelists. And I think a lot of it comes down to this notion of knowledge. And if you look at humans compared to other animals, they acquire an increasing amount of knowledge in their lifetime. That really is quite a distinguishing feature. And neural networks, what they can't seem to do is acquire new knowledge through abstract reasoning or deduction. So when any human looks at a banana, we place it into an abstract category. What is that category? Maybe it's ineffable. And are those categories universal? So you show 2 images to 2 different workers somewhere in the world and say, what's the essence between these 2 images? And if they agree on an abstract category, then maybe machine learning could learn what the category is. But there's an infinite number of abstract categories. So Gadi, over to you. How are we going to solve this problem of acquiring this knowledge algorithmically?
Data by itself and the processing of data through deep learning has value. There are some problems that it can do, and it can do very well. If you ask people in 2012, how will we be able to do natural language processing, not natural language understanding, by 2018, they would not have guessed what BERT brought, for example, transformers. But there's a stage of conceptualization, of creating this concept of a banana, which is more than just creating the manifold that can identify banana in every image that it sees it. And that conceptualization is what starts bringing knowledge, because knowledge is about an ontology and a structure that moves from the physical, from the specific, to concepts. And it does that in a way that there are many instantiations to a concept. So concept is a new level. Knowledge structures, and more importantly, knowledge models, things that can operate and create expected outcome, can simulate things, I believe can approximate it. I believe that by understanding that this is not just a reflection in one surface, but it's a concept that applies to multiple representation, we can create a computational model of that in a kind of more cognitive AI.
I agree with Gadi. Learning from data is useful in many places. It might even prove to be useful in learning concepts. My issue is that concepts, even learning what a banana looks like, is just the beginning of the cognitive journey. Human cognitive capacities go beyond that in ways that it's not in the data in this sense. My child knew what a banana looked like when they were 2 or 3, and what an apple looks like and what an orange looks like. But then they did deductive reasoning. They said, these 3 objects plus grapes plus, they look like they are in the same basket all the time. They're on the same shelf in the store. Obviously, they are a category, right? So we call them fruits. And then we go up in the hierarchy of reasoning. So knowing what a banana looks like and tastes like and feels like is a monumental challenge. But that's the ABC of cognition. That's my only issue, is that we can't reduce our cognitive capacities to extracting stuff from data. Now, I don't want to go to language because there's nothing now called language understanding. I have no issue with the idea that you can learn something from data. Obviously, you can, and obviously it's useful. Actually, it makes a whole species, all the animal species, survive. That's pretty much all they do. So it is huge. But if you try to push that to artificial intelligence, the human level AI, I think people are mistaken for many technical reasons.
You talked about identifying taxonomies. So the fact that it's not just collecting several modalities into being the same object, but having taxonomies and having hierarchical understanding of things. For example, a banana is a fruit that is part of edibles and others. We can construct those hierarchies in the brain. Banana is also part of what's on the table, which is part of what's in our home. And there's a hierarchy of that. So our ability to build hierarchies, associate experiences and attributes, gives us a much richer ability to interpret things than just understanding data and labeling it.
Yeah, I agree. Totally.
I'd like to bring up 2 points. The first point, to come back to Walid, is that it isn't completely clear to me that we can learn categories from data, for the simple reason there's a huge philosophical literature on whether such things as natural kinds exist at all. So I think we can raise a question mark as to whether a machine without human input can learn categories, whether there are in fact human independent categories possible, whether this notion is even coherent. And secondly, if we come back to Gadi's initial point about recognizing images and recognizing bananas and things, it reminded me of a real-life example. One of my best man is a guy called Professor Phil Torr. He's Professor of Computer Vision at Oxford University in the UK, one of the most highly cited computer scientists of his generation. And he spent a lifetime working on designing machines to interpret visual stimuli and done it exceedingly well. And I remember many years ago, he was showing me the output of one of his systems when presented with an image of a horse standing by a fence with some scenery in the background. And the scenery consisted of some hills with some sheep on there. And Phil said to me, look, I can give this image to my computer system, and it says, that's an image of a horse standing by a fence. Now, if you give that image to a sheep farmer, they might say, there's nice longhorn sheep in that image. That might be the first thing that leap out to them. Or if you give it to a meteorologist, they might say, there's a classic example of a cumulonimbus cloud in the sky. So in other words, my point is that there isn't one canonical reading of an image. It's always context dependent. Now, what Phil said to me then, he said, fair enough, I take that point. All I can do is I can give this image to 100 humans and say, what is that image of? And if 80 of them say it's a horse standing by a fence and my machine vision system says the same, then I'm content with that. And I think that's a good engineering response to the question. But I just wanted to unpick the notion that it seems to me that the meaning of images in general is always contingent on the use to which we as humans are going to put them. And the idea that it's somewhat naive to say that there's always one canonical meaning of an image, which somehow a computer can magically extract from that image.
When you look at some of the self-supervised image representation learning algorithms flying around at the moment, they do seem to do exactly that. They learn a universal, monolithic vector representation that seems to make sense in a lot of situations. And Facebook are making the argument that because these things are self-supervised, rather than having some pointillistic human annotated label, it's harder to take a shortcut. So the representations that are learned are really good. And there's a really strong argument, I think, that intelligence is generalization. It is the construction of those abstract categories. But as you just said, Mark, those categories are probably not universal.
On the self-supervised point that you bring up, I think a bit of that is burying our head in the sand and hoping for the best, because back to the sheep and the clouds example, if you're only providing it with pretty much pictures of farmland and not pictures of just the sky with cumulonimbus clouds or night cityscapes with those kind of clouds, is it even going to be able to find that category, right? Is it even going to be able to learn as part of its vector representation the bits that did that type of combinatorial comparison on a subset of images and found...
I guess, Keith, I was arguing from the stronger that we would, let's just assume that you can. Even if you could do that, there's still a problem because the meaning of the image is contingent on the use you're going to put to it.
Right. And so I'm saying even without, that's another complication. So you first have the combinatorial complexity of categories being subsets of the whole. And so you have essentially some subset of the power set, which is just this massively complex space. And then you have the additional complexity of the use or the purpose or the task, as Chalet might put it, that you're applying that category to. So I think even when neural networks work well, they're not exactly efficient with their use of parameter space and data and everything. I don't see where really the hope comes from the idea that just letting it be self-supervised, that it's going to discover all these. I'm a bit pessimistic on that.
Strangely enough, I'm going to defend the deep learning machinery. So to Mark's example of a horse near a fence, and in the background is sheep and grass and maybe cows, all that. The same thing happens in language. People say language is ambiguous because what I read and what you said is different from what someone else read. That's not true, actually, in both cases. We both understand the image and we both understand what was said. That's the understanding. How we interpret things and what our psychological state is and what we see and what we care about. So deep learning will get to a point that it will identify the horse and the fence and the sheep. I have no doubt. Or something like an advanced deep learning technology. That's not my issue. So the issue is not in image recognition. The issue is somewhere else. The issue is I identified, like Gadi said, every object complete. Now what? Can I do reasoning about what I saw? So I don't see the problem.
Don't you think there's feedback between the reasoning system and the recognition system? Because you could theoretically recognize all the elements of the power set of every pixel in the image is something unique, right. But we have a way of pruning it down to subsets that we care about. And I think reasoning plays a role in that, doesn't it?
Right. There's, I have no doubt that there's a feedback mechanism between different modules. the pattern recognition module. Actually, in scene analysis, if I enter an office and I see something brown and long, and it's more likely a cigar than something, obviously there's reasoning that comes in even to image recognition. It's a feat. I agree.
Can I bring in the topic of context? We need to think about two levels of context: a task or domain context and the instantaneous context. The task or domain context is that when there is a task that humans do or machines do around weather or around farming, they look at things in the context of that task. And if it's done by somebody from one domain, it will be a different task than another. And this will take care of some of the points that you're making, because it will pay attention to other aspects of the image rather than take it as something that is always mapped to the same set of embeddings. The second thing is the instance context. And this is something that I've seen just in the last year, where you see AI solutions that are starting to have a feedback loop, where they're looking at particular aspects of an image because of the question or because of something that they need to perform. So when you bring context in, both the domain level context as well as the instance, you can start answering in much more refined manner. And Keith, it does provide you that feedback loop that's required.
Absolutely, and that's really the core point I was just trying to underscore, that we need that context. The idea that we can get the meaning of an image without a context, to me, is meaningless, because there is an infinitude of meanings that we could put onto an image. And to come back to Walid, I know that Walid and I see the world differently when it comes to looking at language and ambiguity in language. I think, kind of after Derrida, that we create the meaning in a text. And I'd like to give an example that I think beautifully illustrates this. I don't know whether you guys are familiar with the group 9 Inch Nails, but Reznor, the singer, created a song called Hurt many years ago. And it was about, on the surface, when the 9 Inch Nails performed the song, about Reznor's struggle with heroin addiction. And a very raw and dramatic piece of music it is too. Many years later, Reznor was approached by Johnny Cash and the team he was working with for permission to Johnny Cash to cover that song. And Reznor was actually quite shocked, because he felt he wasn't that keen on Cash's music. He thought Cash might do some horrible pastiche and it would be dreadful. In the end, Cash produced a version of Hurt that is just astonishingly good. And with the same words, and this is where I come back to Walid, exactly the same words, an utterly different meaning is conveyed. When Cash sings that song, the meaning is him as an old man looking back on his life, and it gives an utterly different take-home point. So the syntax of the words is not sufficient to pin down the meaning of the piece. And I know Walid sees things differently, but I don't. I think there is always a context, and that helps us arrive at the deeper meaning of words. And I think this is, again, beautifully brought forth in any piece of poetry, actually.
Of course. So context cannot be denied by someone that works in language understanding. Obviously, context is important. The context here is not just the words themselves. So part of the communication is the singer, the text. All of that has one meaning, right? The meaning itself is not ambiguous. Our interpretation of something is different. We confuse the two. So we think, because me and you might look at the same content, the same form, the same structure, right, differently, we assume that that thing itself is ambiguous. That thing itself is innocent. It's not ambiguous. Take a painting. A painting is also a structure, not a linguistic structure, but it's a structure. You look at it, I look at it, we see something different in it. The painting itself is innocent. It's not ambiguous. It's saying, this is who I am. That's my content. Same in language. This is my content. How you read it and interpret it is up to you. So when we say, I read it different, take two books. You read them, I read them. You read them different, I read them different. But we both understood what was said. So let's not confuse understanding with our own interpretation our own psychological state of mind, our own biases, but the content itself cannot be ambiguous. If content itself is ambiguous, we would never understand each other.
Why I interjected, and I apologise for cutting in, but there was a good reason for that, because I think that you're hoisted by your own petard. The particular example of art is famously one which is culturally embedded. When you look at a painting, when an art critic looks at a painting, they're not just looking at the image, they're looking at the practice, the social norms, the movements that were going around at the time. That is why when the pissoir was exhibited, Duchamp exhibited the urinal for the first time and wrote, "This is not art" on it. He was making a statement. Now, the average man or woman in the street would look at that and be shocked, although when the pile of bricks was exhibited in the Tate Modern, that's not art, they would say, because anyone can do that. But what they're missing is what makes something art. It's dialogue with the artistic community. It's context, in other words. A piece of art does not exist in a vacuum. Art exists as a dialogue between the artist and a culture which is supporting the art at any one piece of time. So, first of all, so that's why I interjected then, because I just felt the example you were giving was one that was flawed from the get-go. Now, coming to the second point, since Wittgenstein recanted on his earlier work in the Tractatus with the investigations, the famous aphorism that everybody knows who studied any Wittgenstein at all from the investigations is that the meaning of a word lies in its use. It's not a simple absolute definition, it's how it's used in a particular language game. That's what the investigations establishes. And if you disagree with that, then you need to give a decent critique of Wittgenstein. But that's a fairly robust, and I thought a pretty obvious.
Actually, Wittgenstein, the later Wittgenstein, has been demolished and is irrelevant since 200 years. So,
I'm not so certain it has.
I'm quoting the most brilliant philosophers of logic and language. But anyway, I didn't say that there's no context. Actually, you rephrased what I said. The interpretation of the image, I repeat what I'm saying, the interpretation of the structure. You look at a building, everything that this building conveys is in it. It's up to you to see what you want to see. It's up to me to see what I want to see. The object itself is not ambiguous.
I have a quick question for you, Walid. I think one of the things that we're really getting to here is some knowledge needs to be acquired analytically or deduced, right? An example of this, as you said, is the average time complexity of sorting, or maybe the abstract essence of a banana. But if I was going to play devil's advocate with you now, imagine if a deep learning person was in this conversation and they might say to you, well, what if that stuff was in the data? You're arguing that it's not in the data, but it kind of is in the data. You know, Christian Sergedi at Google, he's doing this. He's actually building these tree representations of formulas and analytical reasoning and mathematics. And he thinks that it's actually possible to create new mathematics through this kind of interpolation. So, you know, a deep question is, do you think there are statistical regularities to this kind of analytical type of data that you're talking about?
Right. There is. In some domains where I'm allowed to approximate and I'm allowed to make a decision with a certain probability associated with it, but not in factual knowledge. So there are two types of things we learn. We learn things that, okay, it seems like I am good at recognizing objects. I might sometimes, in those skills, I'm allowed to approximate and I'm allowed to make a decision with some certainty. But most of our knowledge, and I would argue, if you separate what we know from what animals know, almost everything else unique to humans is not learnable. This is I know it sounds like an extreme statement, but I would like people to reflect on that. Almost everything, take everything that animals can do out. Image recognition, sound recognition, just do a compliment, right? What remains and what makes us unique are things that are not learned from observation, from data, from experience. So to say that this paradigm will achieve AGI, you are saying it will achieve the ultimate intelligent rat at best. Everything that is uniquely human is done by deduction, by reasoning, by analytics. It cannot be learned because here's why. All these facts are facts. By definition, they're either true and we know them, or they are still to be discovered. Okay? So we cannot learn them differently. If we learn them, the five of us, because we live a different life, we have different experiences, different observations, we might learn them differently. That's not allowed. So by contradiction, these things are not learned. There's reasoning and deduction. Take the transitivity property. If this object is larger than this object, and this is larger than this, then this is larger than this. This is probably something that we learned and acquired by evolution years ago, because a 2-year-old knows if the ball didn't fit in this briefcase, it will not fit in a smaller one. That's transitivity. That is not learned. You cannot learn this. So yes, you can learn a lot from data. I go back to my initial point. But the best you will achieve is animal-like intelligence. Or if the problem is finite, you can, like games, for example, because you can cover all the possibilities. But in infinite domains like reasoning, planning, understanding, language, there's no amount of data that's enough.
When you learn through school about whether it's math or history or concepts about democracy and others, you have some innate abilities to create structures and to tie them. But there's a lot of learning that is happening through those years. And machines, if they are equipped with the ability not only to look at surface data, because you keep equating a thing, learning, with deep learning, which is looking at surface data. But if machines are capable of constructing the same type of structures and connections and hierarchies and taxonomies, you can introduce them to those and they can adopt them. And if you are able to convey to a machine a hierarchy and relations and an operating model, then that machine can acquire that and use it.
I didn't say we don't learn. Obviously, I learned that I can sort with n log n. We call both types of learning. That's the confusion in language.
I agree.
Language. I didn't learn what a buffalo is by deduction. I just saw a buffalo. There are two types of knowledge acquisition. We have to recognize this. The folk meaning of learning, or I know how to ride a bicycle, or I know a fact, confuses the matter. These are two different types of knowledge. And let me emphasize the difference. I saw a buffalo, and now I know what a buffalo looks like. We use the word I know. So we associate that with knowledge. But I knew that I can sort an n log n, not by seeing two lists, by deduction. This is not from data. I knew what a buffalo looks like by just looking, sensory input. I learned a lot of calculus and a lot of logic, but I didn't learn it by observation, by sensing, by data. No, I learned it by instruction, by deduction, by analytic reasoning. So
so
we learn.
We need analytic reasoning and deduction. But I want to just make a point on models. I believe that what we get from the world at a certain point is a very narrow signal. The way we do a lot of our thinking and understanding is based on internal models. We have a model of a banana, we have a model of animals, and when we get a signal, our intellect operates with those models, and the signal from the outside just tells us which model we should bring up for that. And by doing that, we can have a very rich interaction and reasoning, even if the signal is relatively narrow, because we find the right models that we already have to complete all the missing aspects. Learning is about communicating and helping creating additional models or strengthening models, and then we can operate even on narrow signal based on the models that we already have for similar things.
Yeah, central to my critiques of AI is the notion that I don't believe, for arguments I give in Dancing with the Pixie Reductio, that computation can bring forth consciousness. But I think that this statement has profound implications to do with understanding, because it seems to me, and not just me, for example, Stefan Harnad in his critique of Luciano Floridi's philosophy of information called Lunch Uncertain, Stefan foregrounds the importance of the phenomenal component of understanding a proposition. So I can flesh this out with an example from my own school days. I remember I had to study calculus in my elementary school for my sins. I remember after a little while getting quite good at the application of the formula, such that I could correctly apply the formula in appropriate circumstances and get 10 out of 10 for my math homework. Sometime later, after I mastered that skill, the penny dropped and I understood what calculus was. And that went along with a bodily sensation of understanding. And I contend, and Harned, I think, agrees with this, that in all understanding, there's a phenomenal component. We know when we've grasped the essence of a proposition. And so it seems to me that I think one of the reasons why, if there is a critique that machines can't instantiate phenomenal states, is that's important for machine understanding, as well as the other component, which I believe phenomenology is critical when we're trying to get machines to act of their own volition, to have their own teleology, if you like. Without a phenomenal state where one thing matters to the machine more than another, you can't really have genuine autonomy, because otherwise what the machine does is always hard engineered from the outside by people like Gadi. It's not from the machine's own point of view, because for the machine, without phenomenology, nothing matters more than anything else.
I'd like to pivot this back really to future directions, and really what we're just trying to do is improve the cognitive capabilities of current systems. And I think we probably all agree that they do need to be hybrid. They need to incorporate some ability to do symbolic reasoning. Now, some people favor a modular system where you have, let's say, layers of differentiable neural networks with layers of symbolic reasoning over that, and then they connect together. Others favor one unified thing that's not only differentiable but can somehow represent symbolic reasoning. And I'm curious to get all your takes on which of those approaches you think might be the most fruitful, and if it's the merged thing, like say a differentiable neural computer or a neural Turing machine. It seems like anytime they get closer to symbolic capabilities, they start to lose the optimizability. They start to lose differentiability. It becomes harder and harder to actually search that program space, if you will. So if I could get comments on that, and we'll turn over to Gadi first.
It's, if you like, from the software world, it's object-oriented. It's a modular system, I believe, that has modules that have particular strengths that are built on particular technologies that work very well together. Because, as you mentioned, each technology, if you look at neural networks, they have significant strength in that they understand the whole space, and they can manipulate the manifolds without having to kind of keep dark areas in that. So having modules that are built on some techniques is very effective. However, we need to be able to very well integrate those as part of one large systems. For example, if you have a neural network that needs to extract information in a particular way, you can have a module that retrieves the information, processes it, maybe even does some reasoning before it provides an input back within the embedding space, within the language of the neural network. So you can integrate modules very tightly to create one smooth operation, but I do believe that the future is in creating a hybrid system that is built on very well integrated modules which have strength in one particular approach or another.
I subscribe to that wholeheartedly. Hybrid has to be defined very well, because people worked on hybrid systems for years. They tried to integrate variables and sub-symbolic systems. But these systems didn't go anywhere. I think the idea of modularity it seems to be, even neuroscientists have at least provided evidence that the mind is modular. Jerry Fodor's Modularity of Mind, Marvin Minsky's Society of Mind comes to mind. Things like we have a module, for example, that's good at interpreting colors. We have a module that's good at interpreting sounds or haptic feeling, like the touch. When I touch something, sometimes even without looking, I sort of roughly know what kind of object it is. I don't even have to forget the visuals scene, even by touch. So we have systems that are good at very specific things. We have a module that counts. It looks at a collection of objects and it says, we have 6 things here. So we have specialized modules. None of them is hybrid. The system as a whole is hybrid because it uses everything we've ever discovered. And that makes sense because everything that we know is true can be used somewhere, right? And that's the biggest challenge in my mind for AI.
I know a technology that I've been excited by recently. It's not new anymore, but it's probably well over a decade old now. And that's Monte Carlo tree search and the way that we can use that in exciting ways with neural networks to do some things that are akin to planning and game playing and what have you. I find that very exciting. So that's something my team have been working with for a few years now and doing some kind of fun things. For example, getting a neural network to play games of strategy for itself without having someone having to specifically engineer in advance what things are good and what things are bad. So that's kind of exciting. But the heart of my pronouncements, insofar as they have any heart at all, is just a caution about what these things are achieving and what we can achieve. At the end of the day, I don't see any reason to suppose that AI systems are still going to get things wrong, and badly wrong potentially. The question for the legislating bodies, and I don't know whether everyone's aware, but the EU are now shortly going to enact law akin to the GDPR on the application of AI. I was just reading a critique by Floridi about that today. And we need to be aware that AI will get things wrong occasionally. The big question is, would it get things badly wrong less often than a human? If it does do better than a human in most of the time, then perhaps that's good enough.
What you were saying about the Monte Carlo tree search is fascinating, Mark, because I guess we're talking about what the future is and neurosymbolic methods, and a lot of people don't realize that GPT-3, there's a discrete search over the top of it. AlphaGo, there's a discrete search over the top of it. These so-called sub-symbolic methods, they're still connectionism. They're just ways of encoding discrete information into a neural network. I think it's fair to say that the paradigm in connectionism is that we should have a monolithic approach to artificial intelligence. And people like Gary Marcus, they say that we should have a discrete world model and we should be doing reasoning and planning and acting over this discrete world knowledge. And I think all of us agree, symbolists and connectionists, we agree that common sense is like the dark matter of the universe. It is the bulk of intelligence. That's what we need. But there's an impedance mismatch between connectionism and symbolic systems. And I think it needs to be heterogeneous, but is it discrete first or is it continuous first? And another thing is Rich Sutton says that human knowledge is, it bottlenecks everything. So there's the actual knowledge that we're talking about in our common sense, but there's also knowledge of the architecture itself. Should we fix the architecture or should we create a kind of emergent system that comes later?
The key word is emergent. I compare it to what happened in physics. You have the quantum level, the data level, and you have the high level, the reasoning level at a different point. And how do we connect them? How does a high level reasoning emerge from data, from sensory input? We do pattern recognition, we do sensory data analysis, but that's not enough. There's another level of reasoning and we have to connect the two. So I think modular AI, specialized modules, and how this emergence will happen, and how do these modules talk to each other? That's the challenge in AI. No single paradigm on its own. I mean, we do all kinds of reasoning. No single algorithm on its own or paradigm. Like it's statistics, it's logic, it's algebra, it's set theory, this is ridiculous. We do all of these things. So how do we combine this massive thing we call cognitive abilities into one system? So I think, I don't know who said it, but I agree completely. We're still in alchemy in AI, where chemistry was alchemy. So that's why I'm always surprised, like very soon we will have in 4 or 5 years, we don't even know how to combine these things. So I think we're still doing alchemy in AI. That's my own.
Well, if one looks at the neural network structures people come up with, you certainly get that idea. But I guess to try and steel man the connectionist folks, for example, Mark, maybe it takes an ecosystem of individuals and autonomy and whatnot to create intelligence. But I think we would probably all agree that a human mind, even if it was off by itself on a deserted island, is still an intelligent entity. Like at that point, once it's developed up there in its brain. And there are those who say, look, up there in the brain, we can cut open the brain and look at it, and it is just a bunch of neurons. And even though artificial neural networks are abstractions on that, they throw away a lot of the dynamic detail and the continuity. They capture some essence of what a neuron does, like collect inputs, integrate them together, and fire an output. And so what we often like to ask is, what's missing? Okay, if you take artificial neural networks, what is missing? What's stopping me from creating a huge artificial neural network that can operate enough of what the brain does in order for it to conduct reasoning in these intelligent activities? What's missing? What do we need to add to the artificial neuron or to deep neural networks to give them that capability?
Okay. There's a number of ways that I'd like to approach this. The first approach is to say that when you get a physical system and you build a computational model of it, you do so at a certain level of abstraction. So a neuroscientist who's interested in neural firing frequencies will build a model that accurately models, as accurately as they can, models how a neuron will fire over given particular stimuli to that neuron. Another one might be looking at computation at the cytoskeleton of the neuron. That might involve, as people like Hameroff suggest, quantum processes. So the first question is, you've got to think, what is it you're going to model? And is that thing a computable thing? And that's an interesting question in its own right, because as David Deutsch highlighted in the 80s, and this has been and Lorentz also famously picked up on this with computational simulations of chaotic systems. It can be very difficult to model computationally certain types of complex dynamic system, and some ill-behaved complex dynamic systems. And a number of neuroscientists have pointed to the brain as existing in some of these particularly ill-behaved complex dynamical systems. So it may be that we just can't compute them. So that's one thing. A second thing is, even if you have a system that these aren't ill-behaved chaotic systems, you have a problem. This comes from the work of Boghosian in 2019, who looked at when we want to model real valued numbers, we've got a problem because any representation of real valued numbers is non-uniformly distributed along the real axis, and that can also bring another degree of failure when you're modeling complex real dynamic systems. So I think everyone thinks, oh, it's easy. We'll get a brain, we'll build a model of it. The two fundamental problems are you've got to set your level of analysis, what's interesting to you, without replicating the brain in toto, in which case you've got all the causal powers of a brain because you've built, and people like Craig Ventnor who are building artificial neurons out of real stuff, you're building a brain. Without doing that, you're always concerned with some things that you want to model. And then secondly, there are real questions about whether computation can replicate the causal power of the brain. And I've highlighted a few in that description. So hopefully that gives you some insight on my thinking on these issues, Keith.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Gadi, what's your take on it? What's missing? How do we get there?
Well, so first, you're asking a question of, since neurons are creating the brain and all its capabilities, and deep learning is an emulation of neurons at some level, why can't it do it all? It's like asking in a computer, everything is made of transistors, so everything is the same, isn't it? If you just know how to do logic, or just know how to build memories, or just know how to do any of those, each of those blocks can do everything. And the answer is that you put the building blocks in very different ways. And deep learning is a very specific way to put together some kind of emulation or analogy of a neuron. And even in the brain, there's a difference between the way the V1, V2 structure of the visual pathways work, in which they get the signals from the eyes and they operate it in some way, they map it, and the way the prefrontal cortex work, and the way the areas of the brain that keep memory work and keep the association. One is more about processing, one is more about associative connectivity, and so on. So I'm pretty certain that deep learning in the way they do neural network are very good at some things, are not good, or sometimes not able to do other things. Correlation is not causality, and it's not a good way of memorizing, and connection and so on. So even if we use emulation of neurons, it's not just deep learning. But in terms of the missing capabilities, we need to understand what are the key tasks. And some of the key tasks has to do with processing and some data and transferring to a different plane, which deep learning does very well. Some of it is keeping knowledge in a structure that is associative, that is hierarchical, that is ontology-based. So we need to think about all the constructs and the skills that the brain needs in order to have very strong cognitive abilities.
Walid, what are your thoughts?
First, I love your intro, Keith. I mean, imagine a person, that cliche, on a deserted island, all alone. I think they will be thinking without any contextual information. They will try to shelter, they will try to make fire. But the big question, and you've asked me this before, and I tried to escape answering it for a simple reason. I don't know the answer, which is, if you look at the brain, it's all neurons. I mean, yeah, we know we do reasoning, but in the end, it's all firing. So why is the deep learning paradigm not consistent with? So what is missing? A lot is missing. We don't know, for example, we know we store information. We all agree. We have memories, we have long-term, short-term. Do we know how we store information in our brain? What is missing is a lot more than we like to admit, right? The human brain probably is pretty well understood as a physical, biological organ. But the mind, I don't think we know, I don't want to say anything, we know a few things. The biggest one is, how do we store information? I know we exchange the brain, the neurons fire and different, it's probably not the same mechanism of a deep neural network. I don't know what activation function we have and all that, but we know we have neurons firing and communicating, passing information along. But where do we store information? What's the nature of our memory? How do we keep an image of a banana in the mind? So we have a lot we don't know. What's missing is more than we like to admit. Let's be humble. Let's not say AGI is going to be here 5 years from now. Let's be very humble.
Amazing. Well, gentlemen, this has been an absolutely fascinating panel discussion. All of you are going to finish now with your closing statement.
Our debate so far feels like it's 60 years old. Connectionism, symbolism, Turing machine functionalism, if we want to cross over into the world of cognitive science. But of course, cognitive science has moved on hugely in those 60 years. And one of the things that's been exciting me a lot in the intervening period has been the development of the so-called embodied and inactive and embedded traditions of cognitive science. So if we take this as something interesting, to come back to Keith's point, it's not the individual neurons that bring forth the mind. It's not even a brain, because neurons exist in a culture which is the brain, the human brain. But it's not even the brain on its own, because the brain exists embodied in a physical body. But it's not just the human body existing on its own. The human body exists in an environment like Keith's putative desert island. But it's not just an environment on its own. A human body exists in a human society. And I think all of these things contribute to our cognizing about the world. And in particular, language and social aspects can actually shape, I believe, how we phenomenally see the world. There's been some great work carried out by Jules Davidoff and his team at Goldsmiths that explores how the Himba language can affect their phenomenal colour perception. So if we take these results seriously, then we've got to take the fact that the neurons exist in the brain in the body in the world, and the body in a human social context, all of which gives rise to our human cognitive processes.
Mark, I get your point in embodiment, and I believe I fell in love with George Lakoff's metaphors that all of our meanings and understanding are related to our physical experiences, the real physical manifestations that we. But here's the thing: if you take a chimpanzee, right, and this chimpanzee lives with humans all the time, like any of my kids, he's always with us as much as my kid. And so they're experiencing the same environment, same sounds, the same images, the same music. They're experiencing what my kids are experiencing. And we know that biologically, their brain and our brain are almost 99% identical. This chimpanzee will never reason, will never do abstraction, will never speak, will never communicate. So I agree with you. The environment is important. Nobody is dismissing that, but it's not the sole unique thing about our mind. The human mind is not just a function of rain and sun and pain and touching stones and all that. Chimpanzees can live with us for 1 million years, and they have, and they will never do what we do. The mind is more than just the environment.
But I think if you'd heard what I said, I think for me it's the neurons in our brain, the brain in our body, the body in our environment, and our human bodies in a human culture. All these things bring forth the cognitive processes for the species. That's my position anyway.
Over to Gadi, your closing statement.
If we would have this debate in June of 2011, we would not have been able to predict the tremendous progress that was made by deep learning. And there's going to be so much value to be harvested, to be gained by people, by humanity, from already the capabilities that have been kind of demonstrated and are now being improved. And let me try to look at the next 10 years. And I know, it's hazardous to predict the future, and especially in AI, because you have those quotes of people that says in 5 years, in 10 years. But I still believe that in the coming 10 years, we will have significantly more cognitive machines, not consciousness, not AGI, but machines that have capabilities of understanding across modalities, of synthesizing, of creating results that are truly meaningful. And in order to do that, it's based on having a much better model of the world within the machine. It's not an input-output function. Intelligent beings and intelligent machines need to have a model of the world that is very detailed, that have a lot of capabilities, that have knowledge that is structured in layers, in abstractions, in hierarchy. And then to interpret input within that very rich context, within that very rich modeling, and then create something and be able to continually focus, to Mark's point earlier, on the things that matter, because they have some goals, they have some tasks. And I believe that the first machines with such additional capabilities are going to be seen in the 5 years timeframe. And by 10 years, if we meet at 2031, we will see machines with cognitive abilities that will be able to understand language, will be able to generate new ideas based on concepts, and will be able to interact with humans and be also interpretable and explaining themselves. And more than that, I believe that within those systems, we will start talking about the hierarchy of priorities and values, so that it can start fitting in within our value systems as the one that are responsible for them.
Fantastic. And Walid, your closing statement.
Yeah. So I like Gadi's future prediction. I can predict some future, by the way. 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 50 years from now, the best sorting algorithm will be order n log n. There are things we predict and we approximate, but there's true facts in the universe that we have no option of refuting. It's not all relative and ambiguous, and let's see what the data tells me. If that was the case, we would not have survived 10 years, let alone millions of years. There's a system underneath everything, and I think AI cannot move forward And I'm sorry, Gadi, but I don't see this progress in AI. I mean, it's like UFOs. You hear about them, you never see them. I am aware of the state of the art in language understanding. That's what I do every day. We don't have a system that understands what a 3-year-old understands without even thinking about what they're saying. And the extremism that's happening now, that we're confusing learning with intelligence. Learning is one part of what we do. Our cognitive capacities are much more complex until we understand the real problem, how big it is. Like autonomous driving that ignored the frame problem, it's all going to collapse. No matter how many papers we write, no matter how many news articles claim big things, the reality is we haven't made real progress in discovering anything new in AI.
I would like to come back to Gadi that AI to me is like man's progress in AI is analogous to man's progress at climbing trees as a way to get to the moon. In other words, what we're doing on AI, we're making incremental progress, but it doesn't seem to me that it's going to ever get us to building true AGI in the same way that climbing a tree will never get a human onto the moon.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much for your time in this panel. I think we all really enjoyed it. We've had a blast. Tim, I'll turn it over to you to wrap up.
Folks, this has been an incredible panel discussion. Thank you so much. And for folks listening at home, reach out to us. This is the kind of thing that we can do more regularly. So if you enjoyed this conversation, let us know, and that will give us the motivation to do something similar again.